Welcome to the American Center Online. My name is Jahan Jones-Rakowski. I work in the U.S. Embassy in the Public Affairs section. And today we're going to continue our Martin Luther King Today, MLK Today series, where we're looking at people or organizations that embody the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. And there's been an explosion, I would say, in the U.S. recently, where there have been lots of companies that hire diversity experts or have diversity and inclusion councils or organizations or groups within their mission, because it's become, to the attention of a lot of people, that's very important. So today we're talking to members of the U.S. Embassy's Diversity and Inclusion Council. I have with me today Allison Hanna and Carissa Landis, and I'm going to briefly introduce them before we start talking. Allison joined the State Department in 2006. She served in Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Washington, and Uzbekistan before arriving in Moscow. Originally from Washington State, she has a Bachelor's of Arts from Occidental College in Diplomacy and World Affairs and a Master of Arts from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She first came to Russia in 2000 as a tourist, and then she came back in 2002 to study at the Russian State University for Humanities as part of an exchange program. And now she's back again, so she must love Russia like we do. It's great to have you today with us, Allison. We also have Carissa Landis, who is originally from Anchorage, Alaska. She has a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Dance and Russian Studies from the New York University and a Master's of Arts in Russian and East European Studies from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She joined the State Department in 2018, and U.S. Embassy Moscow is her first overseas posting. Thank you for joining us today, Carissa. All right, so we're happy to take your questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, just put your questions in the chat and they'll make their way to us. And we're going to start off with the question I have is, what is diversity? And that question I'm going to send to you, Carissa. What is diversity?
Right. So diversity is very broad. Diversity can mean diversity in race, in gender expression, ethnicity, religion. But even, when you're thinking about the United States and the State Department, diversity can be diversity of thought, diversity of expression, of geographical diversity. Where are you from in the United States? Whether you're a U.S. citizen who is born outside of the United States or born inside of the United States, whether your native language is English, whether your native language is a different language, all of these are expressions of diversity.
Great, thank you. Okay, and Allison, it's the Diversity and Inclusion Council. So please tell us, what's inclusion? What does that mean?
Well, I think that's a great question, Jahan. I think that's a little more fuzzy in terms of how we define inclusion. I think some people have used the example of diversity is giving someone a seat at the table, and inclusion is letting them talk in the meeting, right? So it's making sure that people's voices are heard and that there's a space where people feel that they can raise their voices and give their opinions. Because in the context of diversity and inclusion in the United States, a lot of times, there's a focus on numbers, right, or statistics. But there's a difference between having statistics saying you have a diverse workforce and having members of your workforce who come from a diverse background feeling included in your workforce. So that's the diversity and inclusion part of our council. And so that's something we also work on.
Great. I think that really put it in perspective, having a seat at the table, but then also being able to speak at that table, because diversity is something we've heard of for a long time, and inclusion just is more recent. And that makes total sense, because you hear people say, well, we have Black students at our school, or we have women in our organization. But the question is, are they actually in leadership, or are they actually putting forth their ideas that you're listening to them? Like those are important, as important as having someone in the organization that represents a diverse background. So speaking of importance, why is this important? We can all answer that question. If you want to start, Carissa, why is it important?
Great. So, this is something that's been really important for forever, really. But I think, as what you were mentioning earlier, Jihan, it's come to the forefront of a lot of people's consciousness with the Black Lives Matter protests this year, or 2020. And it's become a matter of urgency that everyone does deserve the seat at the table, that we need to start re-examining processes to ensure that diversity is represented at all ranks, and that everyone really feels like they belong. So, I mean, it's something that's always been important. I'm really happy to say that now it's starting to get maybe the attention, and I would say even the resources that it deserves. To some extent, you know, the State Department is looking at creating an infrastructure that provides support for diversity and inclusion. And that's something that Allison and I have been really fortunate to be a part of in the creation of the Diversity and Inclusion Council at Embassy Moscow. And, you know, we're just one council at one embassy, but there are diversity and inclusion councils now all over the world. So it's been great to be sharing ideas with each other and, you know, working towards creating this culture of inclusion.
Great, thank you. And so Allison, Carissa mentioned that there are diversity inclusion councils at other embassies. Like, this isn't something novel just in Russia. It isn't as if you only need it here in Russia. And we have it all over the world, and we have it in the State Department as well. Can you tell the viewers, like, what's one benefit you think that the State Department gets from having a diverse workforce?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think they get many benefits. If you want to look at the science, there are numerous studies, Harvard Business School and other elite institutions that have proven that having a more diverse workforce allows you to make better strategic decisions. So it's in the U.S. national interest to have a diverse workforce. It's also in our interest to make sure that that we reflect what America looks like, right? So, you know, America is not just you know, Ambassador Sullivan is one version of America, and we are other versions of America. That America is a multicultural society, much like Russia is, and we want to make sure that we are representing that in our bodies, in our persons overseas, to ensure that we make better analysis and foreign policy decisions. To be quite frank, I think that it's a national imperative that we improve diversity and inclusion in the ranks of the Foreign Service.
Great. And I think also, let's talk a little bit about what are some of the practical things that we're actually doing with the Diversity and Inclusion Council and in our embassy. Carissa, do you want to tell like one example of something that you've done so far being part of the committee, being head of the committee?
Yeah, I'm sorry. If I could actually describe maybe kind of our different prongs of work, maybe that would be helpful.
Great. That would be very helpful. Thanks.
So at the beginning, we kind of identified three areas for our committee to focus on. One was external representation. How can we make sure that the multitude of faces of America are represented as our face of the embassy and of Mission Russia? The other was looking internally. How do we make sure that the community that is the Mission Russia feels included, you know, on a day-to-day basis? And then the third is hiring and recruitment to make sure that the people who are going to be working at Mission Russia represent the diversity of America and of Russia as well. One of the initiatives that's really exciting, I would say, is our accessibility initiative. One of our members is kind of an expert in accessibility, and she is doing a survey of the embassy and of our consular section to make recommendations on how we can improve our facilities for varying abilities and disabilities. So I think that's something that could have a very concrete effect on how people of varying abilities experience physically the American embassy, and that's something I'm very excited about.
That's great. Yeah. And, you know, my family was able to benefit from one of the initiatives within the embassy community. There's a movie series of making sure that the movies that children can watch and the families can watch and anyone can watch, that they're diverse. Sometimes we have movies in the embassy. And so I think it was last week, the week before that, the movie Hidden Figures was played. And I went with my children to watch it. And Hidden Figures, if you don't know, tells a story about within the 60s, 70s, when the U.S. was segregated in some areas, about several Black women who were part of the space exploration process with NASA, and they worked behind the scenes in the computers group, which was before we had computers, we had human computers. And anyway, tell that story. And there's a scene where the woman goes to the whites only library. And my son was like, I thought this was a true story. You can't do that. And I was like, this was in the past. And he was like, what? And then he said, well, that's racist and racism is illegal. So in his, his mind, he was like, this is unfathomable. And I was like, these are some conversations I should have had. I need to have some more conversations. So that movie gave us a chance to talk about it and what was happening in the movie. And in the context of today, having grown up overseas and in the US now, some things he's not aware of, but that movie helped. So I would say, just one little thing that Diversity Inclusion Council has done at the embassy is provide opportunities for the children in the embassy to also learn things, to be part of like coloring contests, to listen to books read about diverse characters. So that's been fantastic. And we have this speaker tracker with the speakers to make sure public affairs, when we have speakers that come out, that the speakers represent all of America, because we have various backgrounds in America and various ethnicities and races and gender groups, and just to make sure all our speakers cover all the areas. So Allison, another question. So I know something that there's a part of the prongs is like the outward looking. Are we looking at our hiring pool when we hire Russians to make sure we hire all kinds of diverse Russians, like from different parts of Russia, like not necessarily the same type? I mean, is that anything we're looking at now?
So I think that's something that, we need to prioritize. Obviously, things have been a little wacky with work and hiring over the course of the past year due to the pandemic, and our, following Moscow and US government regulations to have a lot of people be teleworking. It's made some of our recruitment and hiring initiatives have to sort of take a pause. But I do think it's something we need to focus on, because I don't think a lot of people are aware of the vast diversity of Russia, right? The ethnic diversity, the religious diversity, diversity of languages. So I think that's something that we will be taking a look at, working with the human resources section to see how can we recruit. We make a distinction too between recruitment and hiring, right? You want to attract as many diverse applicants as you can, and you hire the most qualified applicant regardless of their ethnic or religious background. So we want to make sure that we cast the widest net, because maybe the person who's most qualified is from a far-flung part of Russia who wouldn't normally have access. So I think that is important. I think it makes us stronger. It makes us better. On the American side too, making sure that we encourage people of all races, genders, religious backgrounds to apply for diplomat positions in Mission Russia. It's all part and parcel of making sure that we're the strongest team we can be.
Great. No, that's great. The two very, very, very strong, great points. And I want to touch on something that you just mentioned. I think it's really important that you said that we work on recruiting and to putting a message out. I think sometimes when people hear about diversity and hear about seats at the table, they assume that means you're going to take a seat from someone who's already there and kick them out. You're going to prevent someone like, we're only taking Asian Americans. We're only taking, African American women from California. Like, we're only taking this because we don't have anyone Native American, that also speak some other language. We're only taking this group. And so then people get afraid. And, as change, whenever there's change or talk of change or something different, people get afraid. And I think that was a really great point you made, is that we hire the best candidate, and you bring forth the best speaker. We're not just necessarily bringing speakers who only represent a diverse background. It's they happen to do this and they also do that. So I don't know if we want to expand on that a little bit more, but you often hear when people talk about Black Lives Matters, but don't other lives matters? I mean, of course they do. But in that context, in that situation, they're talking about lives that matter because they felt like their lives didn't matter. The situation that happened showed that their lives weren't mattering. Our lives weren't mattering. So let's talk a little bit about that. It's uncomfortable, but how do we make sure people know that diversity isn't excluding you if you're not diverse? Diversity and inclusion is better for all of us, but it doesn't mean that if you happen to not be from a diverse background that you won't be included in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start and maybe Carissa can jump in. That's really at the crux of the discussion about Black Lives Matter and some of the historical racism in the United States. How do you convince people that change is in their interest? It's not easy. I don't have an easy answer. I think making people feel like they're part of the solution is perhaps the best way to go. Like, I am a privileged white woman, right? Like, I haven't lived the experience of a Black person, a person of color in the United States, but I know that it's my duty to try to help correct any problems that have arisen from the U.S. history. And I think I want to be, the protests in the United States and the national discussion we had after them really opened my eyes to the fact that you can be part of the solution. You can help improve diversity in your own workforce, in your own life, and that that is, lifting others up is using your position of privilege in order to benefit the greater good. So that's sort of how I see it. But again, I don't have an easy answer.
Yeah, it's great.
I think something that's been interesting working as co-coordinator of this council is seeing people who express an interest in diversity and inclusion, but are kind of timid, like, oh, I don't really know if I have anything to contribute. And then they come to a meeting and, we're talking about a project and they're like, oh, I have fancy Excel skills, or, oh, like I know I have access to X, Y, and Z resource and I can help with this project. And I think it really highlights that everyone has something to contribute. They just need to be willing to step up.
Right. That's a great point, that this isn't making sure that there's diversity and inclusion isn't left up to one particular group. It isn't like the diverse group's job to do it. It isn't the non-diverse group's job to do it. It's all of our job to do it because we all benefit from it. I remember my first tour, I was a consular officer and there was an interview happening and the woman beside me said, I really want to move forward with this visa, but I'm nervous because the kids don't look like the mom. And we looked over and I said, to me, they look like her, but the children were two different colors. They were like brown skin and light skin. And in that country where I was working, it's very similar to the US African-American background. Like our skin tones change. Like you could have a very dark skinned child and a very light skinned child. And so we had a discussion about it. And, then she started to say, oh yeah, the ears, the nose, this and that, you can see it. And I think that was like a moment where I was like, wow, if I hadn't been sitting here, like that was a diverse moment, that something I never would have thought would have benefited was just that knowledge of what happens, the differences in pigmentation, just something small and tiny as that. So let's get back to like some of the questions with making the embassy more accessible. And I'm waiting for questions. If you have questions, now is the time, because it takes a long time for the questions to go from Facebook Live to us. So don't hold back. Put your questions out there. So we found out that, we really don't have as many ramps and accessibility. What are some things in the long term in the future we think might be able to happen with the embassy and the consulates?
Yeah, it's a matter of resources. I think what we're looking at now with the project is identifying things that are, easily fixed, things that are less easily fixed, and things that require infrastructural change. And it's a matter of allocation of time and resources. It's so silly, but to think that, there are doors that people may need assistance opening, and that there's no sign, so people don't know how to ask for help. So we put up a sign, and it's like small things like that are just so minor, but I think can provide like more empowerment to people, who are moving through the space.
Right. We had that discussion about the doors. That was the first time I actually thought about too, the hidden disabilities and the hidden diversity. Because sometimes you assume you can see someone's diversity by looking at them, but you can't always. And we had a discussion about the doors in the embassy. There was a person who said, you can't tell it, but some people have a disability. They can't, the embassy, for people who don't know, our doors are very heavy. And so the person mentioned that that person couldn't open the doors. And didn't know how to ask for help for opening the doors. And you can't wait for someone to come by to open a door. So that, there are things you could do to get the door open. So that was just something too, like when you're talking about diversity, it isn't always that you can see, oh, that person's diverse and that person's not diverse, because sometimes you can't tell.
I think that's a really good point, Jehan. I think it also goes to, religious diversity is something you hold on the inside, right? Mm-hmm. So making sure that we're a workplace that is accessible to all, regardless of your religious background, that if you need time or a place to pray, that you have that space. So I think that that's, another aspect of the hidden aspect of diversity, right? That right. You can't, we make a lot of snap judgments and decisions. We call them conscious and unconscious biases when we look at someone, but there are a lot of things you can't, maybe for good or bad, tell about someone if you just look at them. So
exactly. Yeah. And that's another one of those key words you mentioned, like unconscious bias is something that we're all coming more and more aware of. The things that we we say or we think that we don't even realize it until someone points it out that, you know, you really shouldn't say that because this is what someone hears when you say that. And that always comes from just having that diverse person or that person who has diversity experience near you saying, hey, you know, this is how that could be interpreted. You know, and also in the State Department, we have what's called EEO counselors. We have people who you can go to if you feel like your diverse category or something that's happening to you is you're being targeted or you're having problems. So I think that's something special within our government and within our embassy, and other groups have that too, but just that ability that you're not alone. You can go to a counselor and you can put forth not necessarily a complaint, but a complaint if it is. You can just find someone to talk to about what is happening, and they're confidential, and they help you. They can help you in the process.
Yeah. You know, and those are required by law, right? That's not optional. I think that's one of the strengths of the U.S. system is the EEO, the process through which you can file a complaint. There are certain protected categories, right? So it's not just like, oh, he doesn't like me because I wear a red shirt, right? It's, you know, he discriminated against me in the workplace as a result of my gender or my race or my religion or different categories. So it is, you know, protected by law. It's been upheld by the courts many times. You know, the process isn't perfect. Every process can be improved, but I think it is an important resource for people who have anywhere in the federal government. It's not unique to embassies. Anyone who has a problem, it's a resource to go to and seek assistance if you don't know what the law says about a category.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I think, I mean, the State Department is incredible and the federal government is incredible bureaucracy. But to some extent, that institutionalization can be helpful. For instance, when it comes to pay scales, when you enter the State Department, it's based on, you know, your experience and your education, and, you know, your race and your name and anything like that doesn't come into it. And when you consider that there's been a lot of studies that say, you know, women don't have the negotiating power compared to men, or women of color tend to be paid less than men, I feel like it kind of evens things out from the very beginning. And that's one of the reasons that I actually like working for the federal government. Not to say that there aren't, you know, many improvements in the system that can be made, but things like that create this kind of standardization that puts everyone on maybe a fairer foot.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It's mandated, so it's a lot less subjective that you can decide the different things. You know, it's based on your background, your working background and your education background is how much you make when you start. Yeah, and then, you know, promotions are when we have our promotion process and we move up. It's based on your work and what's written. It isn't necessarily by committee who can see your face and see who you are. So, and I know some of the things that we've put in place recently, or people enforce a lot, is the process of getting your next job and hiring. There's a lot more people who do like full interviews, and everyone gets interviewed, and everyone gets the same question, and it's more standardized. I think we're moving towards that, and it's not perfect, but we're moving towards something that we can be more proud of than maybe, you know, decades in the past.
Yeah, I think Carissa hit on a good point that, you know, when you enter the Foreign Service or when you join the federal government at the, you know, when you're hired, there's a system of like, you know, gender and race blindness in theory, right? Like that information is not revealed to the people who are doing the hiring. But you know, once people enter the workforce, unconscious biases can creep up, right? And people don't know that, you know, and they don't mean to either. The thing about unconscious bias is that people don't realize they're doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't know that you're accidentally essentially applying a bias against someone. And so I think it takes a lot of courage for people, once we're within the system, to say, hey, our system's not perfect. Let's work and try to change it, and try to correct the progression of people who progression along the career ladder of people who might be disadvantaged because of systemic unconscious bias within the U.S. workforce. So.
Right. We have this training that I think most of us we had mandatory training since we were here in USMC Moscow, and other posted this as well on unconscious bias. And in that training, you get to see different scenarios. And some people, you know, prefer to hire people or work with people who remind them of themselves, who from the same part of the U.S. as them, or who look the same, or who are also single or also persons, and people don't even realize it, that is an unconscious bias. That, like, I just feel like that person's smarter, I just feel like that person's more trustworthy, but it comes down to the fact that maybe it's because you feel more comfortable with that person because they represent the same qualities, background as you. Maybe they went to the same kind of religious background or same geographic background, and so we're working on kind of cracking that and getting away from that and saying that was unconscious bias, and open your eyes and see people for not necessarily under your biases, right? We're still here waiting for questions though. Our audience is very shy tonight, but I'm hoping that we've started the discussion and then the discussion can continue, and perhaps in the future we can come back and answer more questions on, what is diversity and inclusion and why it's important.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jihan, if you want to talk about unconscious bias maybe a little bit more,
Sure.
I was reminded of, I think it's called the Implicit Project, and there's basically this test that you can take for yourself, where I guess it's a cognitive test, and it provides you with all these like flashing words, and you have to kind of click things really fast. And it kind of gives you this thing like, do you have these associations with certain colors? What are your associations with other colors? Are they slightly more positive? Are they slightly more negative? And it's a test that has been done with thousands of people, and it's demonstrated this unconscious bias and association, with certain colors. And it's very revealing and I think really interesting. And I think we all need to maybe like take an opportunity to explore, what our subconscious is saying, and just understand, like, you can think that as progressive as you are, you can think that you're incredibly modern and anti-racist, but the deeper you go, I think the more there is to unpack. And that's a reality of the society that we've grown up with, and yeah, it's just a lot to unpack.
Yeah,
I think there are also some like generational aspects to it. I think that's always at play in any society, right? You have an older generation that has seen how much change has occurred over their lifetime, and they feel like that's an immense amount of change, and they feel satisfied that they were part of the solution. And the younger generation comes along and says, hey, no, we need to close the last 10 yards, or kick the soccer ball into the net, right? Like, you need to finish and get the goal. We haven't even passed the defenders yet, right? To try to correct what wasn't corrected in the parents' or grandparents' lifetime. So I think that's part of the phenomenon in the United States as well. You have younger generations who've grown up in a much more diverse, multicultural society than their parents did, just because of the changing face of America over time. And they recognize and acknowledge the experiences that people have had. And I think their parents and grandparents maybe aren't in an emotional position, kind of like Carissa was saying, to acknowledge that they could go further in breaking down barriers and being, not just diverse, but being anti-racist. I think that's a good term that has come up a lot in the United States, like doing what you can to not just say racism is bad, but do something about it, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We had a discussion some weeks ago here about, what can you do today? What can you do? And one of the things I said was, read different people's narratives, read the experiences of, and in Americans' case, read, African Americans' experience or Mexican Americans' experience. So if you're a man, read a woman's experience. Like, read about the other person's experience. Read their novel. Read their autobiographies and their biographies. Read historical novels. And that helps you kind of understand a little bit better. Watch the movies and that in those genres. So, do you guys have any tips as we, if we don't get a question as we get ready to close out? Do you have any tips if someone says, I want to be anti-racist, or I want to be more inclusive? Do you have any tips?
So actually, Jihan, you provided me something. This is going to reveal kind of something nerdy about me, but I'm a very big quilter, knitter, and sewer. And anti-racism was a really big thing in the knitting and sewing community on Instagram. And that kind of happened about 2 years ago. And a lot of people in the community started saying, who are you following? What designers are you following? like, even if you want to take it, and so you're not reading full books, but like look at your social media. Is your social media diverse? Are you making sure that there's different voices there? And honestly, like making that effort to really look at, like, you know, voices, Maori voices from New Zealand, and Black voices from England, and filling my social media with those voices has really helped me to learn a lot. And there's a lot of smart people on social media talking about anti-racism practices, talking about how it affects their lives. And no one person has the answer, but I think you can learn a lot by just kind of soaking people's personal perspectives in, like you said, although my medium is a little bit shorter.
Yeah, no, it's instantaneous. That's a lot better, easier than reading an entire novel or autobiography.
I think New York Times, Washington Post, and other sort of leading U.S. newspapers too, for the English speakers in the group, have put out, especially last summer during the Black Lives Matter protests, put out very good lists of openly accessible articles that people can read about the concepts of anti-racism. And, one of the suggestions Carissa is absolutely right, is increasing the amount of diversity in the news and information you consume, right? So, for example, those of us who study Russia and Russian politics, making sure that, persons of color who are experts on Russia are included in our information sources. So that's something that we tried to do.
And speaking of that, we have a lot of resources here at the American Center as well. I mean, this Friday, we are going to have a discussion on Amanda Gorman, who, if you do not know, she was the inaugural poet at the last inauguration for President Biden. We also will have a discussion next Wednesday on segregation and desegregation in America with people who lived through the experience, and they will talk about their schools before they were integrated, and just that experience of separate but equal in America. We also will have Yelena Kanga on the show in March, who is a Afro-Russian Black American. She's Russian American. And I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion talking about her book. We will have Mark Meadows on in March, who did a documentary on the Black Lives Matter movement. He's going to show the documentary. He's also going to be here to talk about it. It's like a music documentary. So it's like half music, half musical scores, photos. It's really cool. And it's in March. So we have a lot on our program. And I just want to echo what everyone said. So reading, text, I'm reading like long books, but also getting Instagram and Twitter, following people from diverse backgrounds. We also talked about following the news sources, going to the news sources which have information. Oh, we just have a question in. So do American students read Uncle Tom's Cabin in their literature classes? Because back in the USSR, this novel was studied at schools, and teachers tell children about the painful periods of slavery and segregation. So can I just, I'll jump in real quick and say my part about that, and then we can go around. So I did read Uncle Tom's Cabin in school. I know there's a lot of controversy around it because like now we have this thing called Own Voices, which means you really want to read about a struggle, a situation from a person who lived through it, or a person who researched their ancestors who lived through it. In the case of Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was written by a white American woman who was not a slave, and she took some of the information that she pulled from some slaves, and she wrote it. So I think it's a very good book in the sense that it teaches a lot of people about slavery, but there are also different aspects about it that people also find controversial. There's like the different, like there's a happy slave. There are people who want to stay in slavery, and there are people who stay committed to their master no matter what. And that might have been some people's memories from slavery, but there are definitely most people, or a lot of people in slavery, who did not have that situation. So there are some people who saw it as the way of seeing the horrors of slavery, and others who saw it as a way of maintaining slavery and looking back at slavery as if it was a little more positive than it was. But I don't know. Did you guys read Uncle Tom's Cabin when you were in school?
I was never asked to read it. I never read it.
I'm 42. I read it. I was asked to read it when I was in school. So maybe people were woke when you went to school.
Yeah. I'm almost 40. I didn't read it in school, but I did go to school in the South, in the United States in the 80s and 90s. And we were actually, taught some things in our history classes that were not actually correct, right? Regarding the origins of the Civil War and things like that. So, you kind of know, even when you're in the fourth grade, that what you're being taught is not right. And you go home and ask your mom, and she's like, oh, we live in this place, right? So sort of off topic, but no, we didn't read that book. We read other books sort of on the topic, but mostly by white authors. And I think it's good that there's been a shift now to go towards, reading from the people who lived the experience rather than people who are telling that experience for others. So.
Right. No, I definitely agree about that. And I went to school in Southern Virginia, and we had a Robert E. Lee Elementary School, and they just took down like Confederate statues that were in my in my hometown. And we learned different things about the Civil War. And I went to a predominantly Black school, and our school was in where one of the biggest battles of the Civil War happened. And people still flew the Confederate flags like through my childhood, because there was a lot of pride, and there couldn't be pride from the past, but this isn't a topic. I'm going to go off topic, but I would always, hear like, at the end of the day, it was a separatist movement to separate part of the U.S. from the rest of the U.S. And we can't honor that, no matter how we think about sweet tea and sipping and women in long dresses. Like that was a separatist movement to maintain slavery. But yeah, that's a topic for another day. So please, does anyone else have any more questions? We love to answer your questions about diversity, inclusion, why it's important. Like the movement, I mean, it's been going on for a while. I mean, decades. There have been people who have been working tirelessly on this for years. But, I would say more recently, there's been a very forward-leaning movement to make it inclusive in workplaces, and to make there be a position or people in charge of that, not just like letting it happen by chance. Like people are in charge of diversity and inclusion. So.
Yeah, Jehan, I think you've hit on an important point for the State Department. I think that the State Department and other federal agencies are really trying to elevate positions for diversity and inclusion advisors, so that there's in theory, an expert on these topics who can be a resource to others and say, hey, I'd like to boost, I'd like to reach out to more diverse groups to recruit for my embassy or for my office, what can we do? And so you have a subject matter expert. And I think having someone full-time focus on that makes our workforce stronger and our foreign policy stronger, to be honest, because it's something that we as a society really need to think deeply about and propose concrete solutions for. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jihan, just going back to what you're saying about your school, it brings me to something that I think about a lot, which is our physical spaces that we exist in, and how we make sure that people are represented in those physical spaces. The politics of representation, what holidays are we honoring and marking with our community? What holidays do we not mention? That's really, I think, an opportunity for growth for us. I think making sure, ideally, I think in the future, our council might like to rename a room in the embassy to honor the first Black man to go to Harvard, who happened to be the commercial agent in Vladivostok for the US government at the turn of the 20th century. There are fascinating bits of history that have maybe been historically overlooked. Or, who do we choose to celebrate and who do we choose to overlook? I think needs to be an ongoing conversation. And I think it happens everywhere, and that people are starting to be cognizant of it now. But I think it's really interesting, the politics of representation and kind of moving that in a more diverse and inclusive direction.
I agree. I realized there's a second part of that question that we didn't really touch on. And when part of it was, how do teachers tell children about such painful periods as slavery and segregation? And I think one of the things that the council has done is there was a book reading, and, you can read books to children about things that happened in the past. You can show them things at their level. We talked about the Underground Railroad. My kids know who Harriet Tubman is. We talk about it, but they don't know about whipping. They know about segregation. They don't know about the brutality of Bloody Sunday. So I think that, that's one way you can do it, is you tell your children, you can show them at their level. As they get older, they learn more, but at their different levels, you can teach them about, the periods of slavery and segregation. I don't know if you guys have anything to add.
Yeah. I think we're really lucky that we live in an age in the United States where a lot of literature is produced for children to teach them about, important figures in history that aren't just your mainstream, who are a little bit, like we have a series of books on female scientists, and there's like half of them are women of color and half of them are women who would, in their day and age were perceived as having some sort of disability, right? Autism or something like that. So I think it's interesting because my daughter is fascinated by them, right? And every night we read one like My Little Pony book and one, she calls them like the book with the comment bubbles, because they're, like the characters in the book, like you can see their thoughts in little comment bubbles, so like every night we have like Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, different figures, Jane Goodall on rotation, and some of the topics are hard to talk to her about. She's only 5, so I try to explain to her. She says, well, that's not fair. Why did they put him in jail or something like that? Gandhi, and I say, well, it's our job to try to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. When you grow up, you need to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So she does get a little too excited, tries to apply this in situations where it doesn't quite apply. So we're working on the message, but I think you can talk to kids about it. They understand so much more. She goes to a school where they have a very diverse class. So it's good for her to be aware of the fact that diversity is a positive, I think. So it's hard though. I mean, she's 5. She doesn't understand the concept of like imprisonment or what lawyers or judges are, things like that. So
I think you just made a really good point, Allison. We talked about the importance of diversity in another talk, and again, that's when we talked about what can you do to do better. And I said, we can make sure that our kids go to schools that are diverse. If you have the option of sending your kid to a school or a class when everyone looks like them or prays like them, or from the same economic background, and you have the option of putting them in a school where people are different, you're going to better your child's future. You're going to better life by having them around people who are diverse. You don't have to do anything. You just can put them in the room and they can learn, they can be together, so that when they get older, they've grown up with people who are different from them. And it's not a shock. It's not anything different. They grow up and they see we're all humanity. We're all the same. We all want the same things. And keeping us in situations where you don't have any diversity, you have no inclusion, you have no one who looks nothing like you, everyone looks like you, then you don't get to learn. And same thing for us when we work, finding diverse workforces and working in places where we come across people who are different from us helps make us stronger people.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, I unfortunately went to schools growing up that were, I don't think we had any Black people in our school, like no racial diversity, in terms of religious diversity, like it was pretty bad. So, I don't want that for my children. I want them to understand the virtues of diversity from a young age and not have to learn it when they get older, because it's important and it needs to be part of who they are. So it's a challenge though, because the US still has issues, where you live often dictates where you go to school in the United States. We have a system of property taxes in most states funding schools. So like, how do you make that conscious decision when there's so many other decisions you have to make about your life? But I absolutely agree with you. I think that just, like the more interaction with people who aren't like you, it makes you a better person.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I went to a school where the exact opposite. I think we had 5 white children in my whole entire school, and 3 of them were from the same family. So it was the opposite. And there were people who were biracial, but everyone considered them to be Black. So today's age, we might even break it down. If I went back, I'm like, oh, well, actually, there was that person, that's the person, but it was the opposite. And so what my mom did too was kind of like what you're saying is, I was in activities in other cities and other locations that I was driven to. So I met different people and I interacted with them, but at school and in my neighborhood, it was people who looked just like me. We all, just, yeah.
Yeah. So I actually went to a pretty diverse high school. Anchorage School District is actually one of the most diverse school districts in the country. People don't think about that, but there's an incredible number of immigrants and first-generation Americans from all over Southeast Asia, in particular, Oceania, Mexico. Anyhow, it was a very diverse high school. But I think what was lacking in my education, and I think I hope that will be better for future generations, is any sort of discourse on, here are the honors classes and here's who's in the honors classes, and how did it happen that most of the honors students are white? Clearly there's something wrong with the system when the school is incredibly diverse. I really could have benefited from more honest and continual conversations on race. And I hope that in the future, our country will do better in regards to that.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely have come from a long way. I mean, next week we're talking about segregation, integration. You know, when my mom was in high school, it is, you know, so different from when I was in high school. And when my kids are in high school, it's going to be so different. So I'm proud that we've come a long way, but we still have, like you said, that Allison mentioned her great sport metaphors. We still have to kick the goal or kick the ball in the net or something. I don't know.
I tried. I don't know.
Finish the game, and we're not there yet. But we're not losing any. We're not. We haven't won it, but we're maybe not losing. We're you know, I don't know, fourth quarter, third,
Yeah, it's like more like halftime, right?
seventh inning. I don't know.
Sports metaphor.
It's more than halftime. Yeah. Then again, who knows? You know, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, they can look back at today and think, they only had a diversity inclusion council. You know, they didn't have a. I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see when we are the grandparents' generation, you know,
Yeah.
what are our grandchildren telling us that we didn't do enough of to advance, you know, equality in society. So it'll be an interesting conversation.
Yes, very much. Well, we don't have any more questions. Thank you so much, Allison and Carissa, for joining me tonight to talk about this very important subject and to talk about what we're doing in the embassy and in the State Department to kind of continue this discussion on diversity and inclusion and why it's important and what is it and what we can all do to be anti-racist and be more inclusive. You know, in closing, did any of you want to say, you know, a few more lines and then, you know, before we leave?
I think we've had a good discussion. I appreciate everyone who came virtually to listen today, because it is something that's important for the United States, and we're happy that we get to talk about it to other people and raise awareness.
Yeah, I was just going to say, being part of the conversation is step one. You know, having the conversation is step one. So, you know, reading and education and using the internet as much as possible, I think, is probably the next step for the person and anyone who's wondering kind of where do they go on this journey. But if anyone was joining us tonight, thank you so much for, you know, a conversation, which is step one.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you, ladies, for joining me as well. Goodbye.